So these notes are going to cover 11.4, which is all the conflicts in the Middle East. So in 11.3, you learned more about what was going on in the Middle East, the basic makeup of it. This is going to be the conflicts that resulted from decolonization and kind of the exit of the Europeans from that area. So we're going to start with Israel because they are one of the more long-going conflicts over in the Middle East, the issues that they're having with their Arab neighbors, and they're also one of the more powerful nations in the Middle East. So Israel has fought a long series of wars from its founding against its Arab neighbors. Those are the nations that surround it, and those are known collectively as the Israeli-Arab Wars. So in 1948, immediately after Israel is founded, as you learned in the last notes, all of Israel's neighbors, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, they all launch a war to try and annihilate Israel and remove it from the Middle East. Somehow, Israel wins, even though it's fighting in its first year of being a country, and pushes these nations back. The important one that I really want you to star is going to be the 6-Day War. So the 6-Day War is a 6-day war where Israel fights again a coalition of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, and they invade Israel again to try and destroy it. Israel wins the war, again an underdog victory, and captures all these different territories from all these different nations. So it captures Sinai from the Egyptians, East Jerusalem from the Jordanians, and it really changes up the landscape of the Middle East. Suddenly, Israel is a lot larger nation. It's a lot more powerful, and it kind of shakes everything up. Again, in 1973, Israel's Arab neighbors, especially Egypt and Syria, launched the Yom Kippur Wars, kind of a sneak attack on the Israelis. Israel wins and continues to take more territories. So Israel is just expanding over this time, winning war after war. You can see that they're fighting a war about every, 10, 20 years-ish, and it really destabilizes the region. So there has to be something done to get peace. This video just goes over the 6-Day War. It should be unblocked. It's from History Channel. It's just a really good source. So here's how the actual wars went and who won and who took what. I'd like you to focus on this map over here. Before the 6-Day War, Israel was a very small country, surrounded by very powerful large neighbors. After the 6-Day War, Israel has almost tripled the size of its nation. It seized a lot of territory from Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. The main conflict, though, in Israel is between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So Israel and Palestine exist in the same place. The Israeli Jews and the Palestinians are Muslim Arabs. The Palestinians are led by the Palestinian Liberation Organization during this time period. They are fighting against Israel. Their goal is to establish a separate state, so a separate government for this Palestinian people. Their leader, right up here in the corner, Yasser Arafat, he's going to be the main leader pretty much all the way through, I think, the 80s. Originally, they start off as more a political group, but then they began to expand, and they begin acts of terrorism. They would hijack planes for hostages and demand the release of, Palestinian prisoners or territory back. And eventually, it all kind of comes together in 1972, where the PLO actually attacks the Israeli athletes in their hotel at the 1972 Olympics, and those Israeli athletes were all executed. They do a lot of their uprisings through what are called infantadas. These are uprisings against Israel where the Palestinian areas will try and get rid of the Israelis in their area, throw the Israeli government out, and kind of have their own rule. The big obstacles to peace in Israel. First, the Palestinian Authority, who actually rules the Palestinian territories, is split between the Fatah Party, which is less extreme. They're more of a government. They want to negotiate with Israel, and Hamas, which is an Islamic extremist group. They have a strict interpretation of Islam, and they want to see Israel actually wiped out. Palestinian refugees who have fled to countries after the Arab-Israeli wars and want to return to their land, but a lot of their land is now under Israeli control. One of the biggest is going to be Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is kind of the center of this whole area. And it is sacred to Jews and Christians. It's their most sacred city, and I think it's the third most sacred city in Islam. So all the religions, the Jews, the Muslims, Christians, they all want control over Jerusalem. Jewish settlements, so the Jewish have continued to spread their settlements across Palestine and claim more territory. And then finally, Israel is terrified of Hamas and Hezbollah, who are both terrorist organizations who launch attacks into Israel itself. So some ideas to solutions to the conflict, and there's been a lot of approaches to try and solve the conflict. In 1979, Egypt and Israel actually did sign a peace treaty to end all the wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Israel agreed to give back some territory, specifically the Sinai, to the Egyptians, and in exchange, the Egyptians agreed to finally recognize that Israel had a right to exist. One of the more important ones was the Oslo Accords. So the Oslo Accords are between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and it creates a Palestinian Authority, which is it's a nation inside of Israel where the Palestinians can rule themselves. And if you look here, the Palestinians get most of this area that's called the West Bank, and they get all of Gaza. This is where the Palestinians live. It gives them limited self-rule. Finally, the PLO, who is launching all those terrorist attacks, they agree no more terrorist attacks, and they just become a normal political party inside of the Palestinian Authority. The solution that is proposed by the UN is the two-state solution. And the goal of this is there will be two separate homelands, one for the Jewish people and one for the Palestinian Arabs, and they'll actually be separated. So the Arabs would get this kind of goldish yellow color. The Jews would get this kind of, orangish color. The issue with this is they're so mixed together, as you can see on the other maps. It's not clear who would go where. And also, Jerusalem would be a UN city, so nobody would get control of it. One of the major obstacles to this is the Islamists. The hardcore Islamic extremists reject this plan. They want the whole territory. They don't just want this little bit. So we're going to move on now to conflict in Iraq, which is going to involve the United States a lot more. So after Iraq gained its independence, it was a monarchy for a little bit, but we're going to start in 73 when this guy, Saddam Hussein, takes over. He takes over. He is an Arab nationalist. He is a brutal dictator. He crushes any resistance. If you remember back to that group, the Kurds, you can look down here at the religious and ethnic breakup of Iraq. Iraq is broken into three main groups. You have the Sunnis, who are a minority. They are not the most of the population. They are the minority. They rule Iraq during Saddam's time. He is a Sunni. You have the Shia Muslims, who are a majority, but they are kind of persecuted by the Sunnis. And then you have a small Kurd minority up in the north. Saddam really does not like the Kurds. He persecutes them a lot, and he uses them as kind of a scapegoat to unite the other two groups against the Kurds. Saddam is a hardcore dictator. He's not popular with the people, but he kind of holds Iraq together with an iron fist. He thinks that he is kind of the future of the Arab world, and he needs to unite the Arab world. So he launches the Iran-Iraq War in 1980. This is going to be Iraq invading Iran to control the oil fields. If you remember back, oil is one of the key components of the economy in the Middle East. Controlling the oil means you control the money, so Saddam wants to control it. The war turns into a stalemate. If you look at the pictures, it really is kind of like World War I. Neither side can gain control, so they just kind of dig these long trench lines to fight each other. They use chemical weapons. It leads to millions of dead, and it destabilizes the entire region. After that, Saddam looked for more ways to gain revenue from oil, so he invades his neighbor, Kuwait, the tiny little country below him. Kuwait had a ton of oil. He said that it was part of Iraq, so he invades it, but Kuwait was protected by the United States. So the United States leads a coalition to then push Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis out, and Saddam retains his power. The last war for Saddam will be in 2003. Saddam Hussein was accused of supporting the terrorist who committed 9/11. So the United States invades, and we were looking for two things. One, evidence of him supporting terrorism, and if he was stockpiling what's called WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. You can think of these as chemical weapons, as biological weapons, nuclear weapons. This ends up with Saddam Hussein being thrown out of power, but no WMDs are found. It's a very controversial invasion to this day. It happened after we invaded Afghanistan, and again, it destabilizes the region. So you can see the Gulf War here. The Gulf War, what you should make note of, this is the first time America flexes its muscle after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone. The United States is the only superpower, and we kind of proved that, like, you don't mess with the United States. We completely annihilate the Iraqi army in a matter of days. I think in a matter of hours, their entire air force was destroyed by the United States. After the United States invades Iraq, after Saddam Hussein is removed from power, Iraq struggles a lot because it starts a conflict between the Shia. So Shiite is another word for Shia. You have two words. The Shia and the Sunnis begin to attack each other. There's an insurgency of terrorists. Al-Qaeda fighters come into Iraq and start the insurgency against the United States, blowing up U.S. vehicles, attacking U.S. personnel, and Iraq kind of falls into this like lawless state. Which leads us to our final part, which is the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIS. So ISIS originally started as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but they became too extreme for Al-Qaeda and they broke away. In 2014, they attacked areas all across Iraq and Syria. And as you can see, they controlled a huge portion of both of the countries. They're extremely brutal. Other groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they'll allow Christians to live in their country. They'll allow Shia Muslims to live in their country. But ISIS believes that Christians, other religions, Jews, Westerners, Shia Muslims have to be exterminated and removed because they are not worthy enough. They're probably the most radical of the terrorist groups. They will be defeated in 2019, but even today they're still around and they do launch terrorist attacks. So the Arab Spring is the last thing we're going to cover. And this is a movement all across the Arab world, all the way from Egypt to Iraq, Turkey to Yemen, where there are pro-democracy uprisings. Now, these aren't all civil wars. A lot of them are just protest movements where the people said, we no longer want a dictator. We want more freedom. We want more civil rights. There's mixed results. Some result in democratic governments. They overthrow their government or they get an election and they elect a democracy. Some of them, it causes economic collapse and civil wars, like in the case of Syria. A lot of them, the governments will begin pushing back. They'll begin killing their own people, which causes an armed rebellion, which leads to a civil war. So the Syrian Civil War is kind of a case study that we'll look at out of the Arab Spring. So the Syrian Civil War starts with the Assad family. They rule Syria. So if you look at this map here, okay, Syria is up near Turkey, right beside Israel here, and right beside Iraq. It is mostly desert in this area. Most of the population lives over here. It's extremely diverse. There is everything from Christians, Jews, Sunnis, Shia, Druze, Alawites. Every single religion in the Middle East can be found there. It's very diverse. It has a lot of different ethnic groups as well. And the Assad family rules it with an absolute iron fist. The Arab Spring begins an uprising against Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria. He comes in and he absolutely crushes it. With tanks, with guns, he begins killing protesters, killing his own people, and an armed conflict begins as a result. There are many different armed groups during the civil war. It is not a clean civil war. There's the Syrian government on one side, and then the other side, there's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all kinds of different radical Islamist groups. You have pro-democracy rebels who are supported by the United States. Israel gets involved for a little bit. The Russians even begin bombing. The Chinese are involved. Turkey's involved. Pretty much every country comes together in every different kind of group. And that's why the Syrian war has lasted so long. I mean, it's in its sixth, going into its seventh year. It ends up, this number should be updated now. I think it's up to 200,000 deaths and millions of refugees. As you can see from this picture over here, people are just fleeing Syria in droves because there's nothing left as a result of the war. So that's kind of a little case study of the modern Middle East and the conflicts that came out of it. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'd be more than happy to help you.